And now we move on to the third game in the series, Valkyria Chronicles 3 Unrecorded Chronicles. And wow, that title might actually ring true for the game, at least for countries outside Japan, with Valkyria Chronicles 2 North America sales being less than stellar to say the least. The third game never made it outside of Japan. And not only that, the third game was also developed for the PSP as well, like the second game. But despite that, fans had been adamant about Valkyria Chronicles 3, with there being a fan translation of the third game that's out. And I have to say, Valkyria Chronicles 3 is really good. Between this game and the second game, I think Valkyria Chronicles 3 is probably the one that managed to almost match the heights that the first game achieved. In a lot of ways, it tries to fix the shortcoming of the second game, which works to the game's favor, but can also sometimes work against it. I get into more detail on that later on. But despite that, it feels like its own game still, with the stories and characters it's tried to tell, the world building that's in the game, the gameplay additions. It still feels like Valkyria Chronicles, but expanded and told in a different and interesting light. But without further delay, let's take a closer look at this title, shall we? Hello, I am Peter47890/Sirus, and welcome to my review of Valkyria Chronicles 3 Unrecorded Chronicles. Now, in terms of talking about the presentation in terms of the production value in this game, I now discuss what I mean when I said that this game feels like it's trying to fix the shortcomings of the second game for both good and ill. What I mean by that is that this game feels really similar to the second game. There are differences that does differentiate the second game and this game, but the differences are more additions and modifications of the second game, rather than the third game feeling like a unique game all of its own. As a result, the third game can feel like a rehash of the second game in some departments. And the presentation is sadly one of those departments, at least in terms of graphics. The graphics in Valkyria Chronicles 3 pretty much looks like the same as the second game. There are some visual differences just based on the visual design of the third game compared to the second game, but they are reusing the same graphical engine for the second game, which can feel a bit lazy when the third game is supposedly the next game in the saga. But with that said, Valkyria Chronicles 3 still looks pretty good for a PSP title. Yeah, the graphical engine looks the same as the second game, and they do reuse assets, but it's still a good looking PSP game, with the usual Valkyria Chronicles artistic flair. There are still various influences of World War II Europe setting mixing with the fantastical Valkyria Chronicle elements in the game itself. That's still interesting to see. And that's not to say the visuals are exactly the same. The anime art style itself is a bit different. There's this sketching outline that's more pronounced in this game than in the second game. The visual design also seems more dark and even a tad gritty at times, with the muted backgrounds in some scenes, emphasizing the more dark feel of the third game, but still captured the light-hearted and cozy moments too. The art style is appropriately harsh when it needs to be, but also very intimate too. And the character design really stands out. While each member in the Nameless are wearing the Nameless uniform, there's still personal touches done in each character uniform that does emphasize their personality or background, that does make the character design of the Nameless more pronounced and stands out more. Suffice to say, Valkyria Chronicles 3, while reusing assets, still had a distinctive visual design to the game. The sound design is also similar. The soundtrack uses some of the tracks in Valkyria Chronicles 1 and 2, and to good effect, but also has some new tracks as well, that is more somber and even intense at times to match the darker tone of the story that the game tries to tell, but also has some incredibly upbeat, catchy, Celtic-esque themes that emphasizes the more light-hearted moments that the Nameless goes through. Again, like the visual, Valkyria Chronicles 3 does reuse some assets, but also has things that differentiate it from the previous games. And the reused tracks that they do use, they use it in great effect. And now for the voice acting. like in my Feast Day Night review, it's in Japanese. And I can't really judge it because I don't really have the context of the Japanese language to judge it, so it would be unfair for me to critique it. And now we get to the story of Valkyria Chronicles 3. Like I said before, the game takes place at the same time as the first game, with the war between the Empire and Gallia, but you play as Kurt, a graduate from the prestigious Lancio Academy who has enlisted to the main army as an officer to fight the Imperials off and to start his military career, with things seemingly going well, with him being able to lead his squad to victory in his first deployments thanks to his stratagems. But just as suddenly, he was suddenly framed as a traitor to the country and now has been transferred to the penal squad known as the Nameless, a squad made up of criminals, deserters, and military offenders, where the name of each individual member has been stricken off from the record, with each member being identified as a number, with the Nameless taking most dangerous and dubious missions. So essentially a Black Ops group. But there is hope with the possibility of gaining amnesty if the Nameless can earn accolades in the battles to come, and so begins Kurt's journey to lead the Nameless in the upcoming war between the Empire and Gallia to earn his name back. So just from that description, you expect the story to have a darker tone than the past two games, just based on the premise on the Nameless and how they are a Black Ops group in essence. And yeah, it is. You really do see the more underhanded side of the Gallia main army. Even more underhanded did they appear in the first and second game, with you even seeing the Nameless taking on secret missions that break international treaties in the in-game universe, along with missions that are pretty much suicide runs, which overall provide good world building as well as providing high stakes for the Nameless so we can get invested in their victory. It's interesting to see the character interact with the high tension mission and what they think of it, and the solution that Kurt has to come up for said mission. You really do get a good feeling of the tension that the characters are feeling being handed down these dangerous missions. And it really does feel like this is a squad with how they discuss their thoughts on the mission and how they're going to get through it. A good amount of the squad does feel integral with their interactions in the main story, and you have a good grasp of each character's colorful personalities, and you really do see the progression of the bond that these characters have from the start of the game, where a good amount of these characters doesn't even fight alongside Kurt. They don't even trust them. But as the game progresses, the Nameless does feel like proper comrade-in-arms, and have a close connection to each other and are stronger people because of what they went through. The characters themselves are also really good in this game. I wouldn't say they feel like normal everyday citizens like how Welkin and the group was, but I think it actually makes sense given this is a Black Ops group comprised of criminals, military offenders, and etc. Albeit a good amount of the people in the Nameless aren't bad people, and are just people that got there by being on the wrong side of a Gallian officer, some disobeyed orders in order to do what they think is right, or even some people transferred here for their own personal reasons. So you wouldn't really expect normal everyday people to be in this group. I think this works to the cast of characters' advantage. It is a rather eccentric cast of characters, with each having very distinct and likable personalities, and you do understand how their eccentricities could land them in the Nameless. And even the more normal personalities are interesting because you're wondering how such a normal individual would be in the Nameless, whether if they did something in the past that landed them there or even transfer there. Heck, why would anybody transfer to a unit such as the Nameless? And that does do a good job of trying to learn more about these more normal people in the squad. But even with the peculiarity of the cast, they still feel very human. You seeing what drives them, seeing their backstories on how they got into Nameless, or seeing them develop, and etc. These character stories are interesting and can be really emotionally gripping by the end of it, ranging from being optimistic, bittersweet, or sometimes even tragic. And you really do see why these characters are what they are from learning their individual stories, which makes them interesting and makes you root for them to succeed. And I do really like how varied this cast of characters are, which makes from some interesting interactions and stories. The plot is also pretty interesting, not only with it having to deal with the dangerous missions that the Nameless have to undertake to take down the Imperials, but also the intrigue with there being a conspiracy behind Isler, and I do like the Nameless don't always come out on top of the missions they undertake. There are some instances that they do lose. I think that makes things interesting throughout the story, with there being a good possibility that the Nameless might not complete their mission and be in hot water. This really does add a pinch of unpredictability of what might happen in the story and keeps the player guessing and invested to see what's going to happen next. But it also makes the Nameless feel more relatable in a sense, because not every battle in a war is going to end in victory for the protagonist, and make the Nameless feel more human. And this applies to the character stories as well, with you seeing how that loss developed these characters and see how they overcome that loss and learn from it. And in relation to the game's darker tone, the game also focuses a lot on the Darkson persecution, with you even seeing how unfairly the Darksons are treating Gallia. You get a good gist of it from the previous games, but you really do see there's more of a focus of it in this game. And the focus on the Darkson persecution probably does give light to what is probably the best antagonistic force in the series thus far, which is Calamity Raven. Calamity Raven is basically a Black Ops group, like the Nameless, but on the Imperial side, but is comprised entirely of Darksons, fighting for the Empire, which is hugely prejudiced against the Darksons, which is putting it lightly. And they do this on hopes of being able to gain land of their own in a place they can be Darksons without persecution. And what makes them interesting is that you do understand why they do this. Why they fight just based on the Darkson persecution you see in the game. That it's very understandable that the world is no friends with the Darksons, and that if there is a slim chance they can improve their lives, not only for themselves, but for their families and even for future Darksons, it's a chance they're willing to take, even if it means siding with the Empire. The Empire is so prejudiced against the Darksons that it organized hunts to purge Darksons from its population. I do like how multi-layered they are as a group, and what makes Calamity Raven so effective is Dahu. Oh, Dahu, what a great antagonist he is. Dahu is just so likable with how charismatic and passionate he is about his cause, that you understand why all of Calamity Raven follows him, and you understand why he would fight for such a cause, given the Darkson prejudice that is prevalent in all of Europa. And it's really interesting to see the lengths he would go to achieve such a goal, even if it means fighting with the Empire, where Darkson persecution is at its worst. I also like how intimidating both Calamity Raven and Dahu is. Whenever you fight Calamity Raven in this game, it's going to be a hard-earned fight, with them really do feeling like a specialized Black Ops group that you're fighting, which I really appreciate. Calamity overall is just an excellently done antagonistic force in Valkyria Chronicles 3. And now there's the world building in this game. This game really does let us know more about Gallia and expands on the history of Valkyria Chronicles as a whole, like how there's an actual reason why the soldiers in this universe have such distinct uniforms. We also learn how Gallia used to be part of the Empire till they fought for their independence, and etc. Valkyria Chronicles 3 does expand on the overall lore of the world. Now that I've been positive with the story of Valkyria Chronicles 3, with it having an interesting premise of the dark tone that it follows through, an extremely likable, very interesting cast of characters that you want to see succeed, as well as it having a well done group of antagonists that are threatening but also feel very human. But there are flaws to the story. I do think the final chapter is a bit rushed in terms of explaining what Dahu ultimately does at the end of the game, and feels sort of a character for him to do, which I do find jarring. The various cameo missions also can feel like padding sometimes. It is nice to see as many cameos as there is in Valkyria Chronicles 3, and believe me, there is a lot of it. In fact, you meet all the main protagonists in the first two games in 3, as well as some of the antagonists in Valkyria Chronicles 1 and 2, which is quite a coincidence. And a decent amount of them do have significance in the story, it's nice to see, but a few of the others feel like it's just pandering, which can be distracting.
敵発見。普通だろ。
And now we get to the gameplay of Valkyria Chronicles 3. Now, like the graphical engine that Valkyria Chronicles 3 is pretty much Valkyria Chronicles 2, the combat engine that this game uses is the same engine that was used in 2. But there are additions and modifications added to the system that does differentiate 3 from 2, gameplay-wise. But first, let's talk about the overlying structure of Valkyria Chronicles 3, which is pretty different from the second game and similar to the first game. In Valkyria Chronicles 3, there's a map interface which you progress through the story by going to points where you watch cutscenes, as well as there being other points where you fight battles. And then you just progress linearly through these points. There's also a base camp point on the map where you'll be able to go back to your base camp to upgrade and prepare your units, whether by leveling them up, by training them, or buying better equipment, and etc. There are also optional cutscenes you can see through the story that does add to the characters. So far it sounds pretty similar to the first game in terms of how it works. The big difference in the structure are probably how you gain access to character fragments, which are character side stories, and how the filler missions is laid out. To gain access to the character fragments, you basically have to, well, use these characters for quite a bit, like in Valkyria Chronicles 2 to unlock them, then go to the world map where you can see all the main story chapters, then switch to the character fragment sections. Now with how the filler missions are laid out, it's similar to Valkyria Chronicles 2, where you have to go through quite a bit of filler missions in order to progress in the main mission of the chapter, and it is obvious which are the main story battles and which are the filler missions, but how they present the filler battles is different. As you complete the filler missions, you see how your group progressively go through the map to their main objective, which I think is a really nice touch and give a good feel of progression in terms of going through the map story-wise. And overall, the structure of Valkyria Chronicles 3 is done well. It's straightforward and easy to understand in terms of how to progress the game, and I think the map interface system is a good throwback to the book format in the first game. And I do really like it as a framing device in terms of how it tells the story of Valkyria Chronicles 3, even more so than the book format. I like how it's visually designed like you're looking at a report, which really does make the game feel like it's being told through an elaborate military report, which is a brilliant way to tell the type of story that the game is trying to display, which was to show you the war between Gallia and the Imperials in another perspective, in the perspective of a Black Ops group, to show you the hidden stories of these unsung heroes, to see from how in the map interface you see there being small notes here and there, you see how ally and enemy units move in accordance to how far you go in the chapter, to even looking at the character profiles in the base map. It's like one elaborate military report on the name list, which is overall really well done. And now we get to the combat of Valkyria Chronicles 3. Like I said, Valkyria Chronicles 3 basically uses Valkyria Chronicles 2 Blitz combat engine with a few additions and modifications. That is to say, the combat system still utilizes the mix of the class-based nature and level design of SRPG with real-time third-person shooter action, with you bringing a variety of units with you in battle, with you having to utilize the overhead map in order to know the general terrain and enemy placement to make decisions on which unit to use, and the real-time third-person shooter action in terms of having a more specific look at the area in a third-person shooter perspective, as well as knowing the strengths and weaknesses of each class in terms of how far they can move, the weapons and utilities they can bring in battle, and utilizing them in a third-person shooter perspective, all in order to defeat opposing forces. Whether that be using your scouts' impressive movement range to try to get a position, but at the risk of your scouts possibly being gunned down by enemy interception fire with the scouts' low defensive capabilities, or using more CP to move out your shock troopers in order to more safely clear up any enemy encampments with the shock trooper balanced skill set, or even just setting up a defensive perimeter with some of your more heavy hitters, such as your shock troopers or gunners, to mow down any enemies that get near your encampment with their interception fire, or using lancers to take down tanks, and etc. The type of classing of Valkyria Chronicles 3 is mostly the same as 2, with the base class being Scout, Shock Trooper, Engineer, Tech, and Lancer. with the upgraded class paths being the same too, with there still being branching classes that either emphasize the strength of the base class by strengthening what's already there with the elite version of those classes, or classes that emphasize the base class in different interesting ways, such as the A-Theme Core being able to buff, with the downside that it can't heal as much as the Elite Engineer, or Gunners being more defensive units with the devastating interception fire, but their normal gunfire when you do attack is rather limited compared to the Shock Trooper, or the Fencer emphasizing their offensive capabilities compared to the tech defenses. Okay, so far, Valkyria Chronicles 3 does seem like the same game as 2 in terms of classes. But while the classes still function the same as the second game, there are still some interesting changes to the classes themselves in the third game that does changes up the gameplay. Well, the most defining one is the tech class, and changes that the tech class shield will expand when it ends its turn, which will allow your other units to get protected from gunfire if they get behind the tech shield, which can make for some interesting strategies you can come up with for that. Another change is that all tanks now only cost 1 CP in the game, which does make tanks more viable to use, but the offset to that is that anti-tank rounds have limited ammo, which does balance it in a good way. The game also used the multi-map system from 2 to try to make up for the fact that it is a PSP game and you can have very large maps with large player counts on it, but it has a nice compromise with there being more emphasis on capturing bases and strategies on handling your units on multiple fronts. Potential also remains the same, with potentials being unique passive abilities that a unit can activate that will either improve their capabilities or even impede them, with each character having their own sets of potentials they can unlock to differentiate them from their class potentials to their own personal potentials. Now, in terms of additions to the combat system, there's really only one big addition, which is the introduction of SP points and special abilities. The SP points is mostly used for the special abilities that Kurt Relia or MK can use, and when activated, can be really powerful in battle when used in the right situation. Okay, probably not Kurt's. Kurt's special ability is kinda underwhelming. I'm mostly just referring to Relia and Imka's special abilities, with Imka being able to hit multiple units with a barrage of rockets that can wreck multiple targets within her line of sight, or Relia's Valkyria ability, where she is able to turn into a pure force of destruction, with her not being able to be damaged by anything, with her lance being incredibly powerful, but her lance can only target one enemy at a time, unlike Imka, who can strike many targets. But also know that Relia will turn back to normal after her turn ends, so be sure to position her in a way that she doesn't get downed by the enemy. Each has their strengths and shortcomings, but when utilized in the right situation, can turn the tide of battle in a blink of an eye. But know that you have a set amount of SP points that you can use in each battle, and you cannot recover the SP points during the duration of the battle, so you have to be careful with how you use your SP points. Overall, the combat in Valkyria Chronicles 3 is really good. In some ways, it can be seen as a retrend of Valkyria Chronicles 2, since it does use the same combat engine as Valkyria Chronicles 2, without any significant mechanical changes. But while it doesn't have any mechanical changes, I do think the small changes that Valkyria Chronicles 3 does improve the combat in interesting ways. One example is how the tech shield can be used as cover for your other units when traversing the field, which gives you more options in how to tackle the battle. The small minute changes in the end does give way for more interesting ways for a class to function in the game. The SP abilities also feel great to use with just how powerful they are and how game changing they can be, with you still having to think on how to effectively use them since they have limitations to them, either by having to find a good vantage point for Imka to use her SP abilities effectively, or make sure that Relia is out of harm's way when her Valkyria mode is done with, as well as knowing that you can only use them sparingly in battle. But what makes the SP ability work, well in fact the entire game, is probably the difficulty of the game. Valkyria Chronicles 3 is probably the hardest game in the series, with Interception Fire being the deadliest out of all the games in the saga, with you having to consider the strategy on how to take the base encampment, without just recklessly charging in, as well as considering enemy forces comprising interesting class mix-ups. You really do have to consider the strength and weakness of each class under your disposal, as well as enemies, and know when is the right time to use them, as well as knowing the terrain to come up with appropriate strategies, such as sending your scouts to take a shortcut to better take a base camp from behind, as well as making use of snipers to weaken the base defenses from afar, or using your tanks as cover from machine gun fire so that your shot trooper can come in and sweep through the enemy lines, or positioning powerful gunners to protect the base camp so that you don't have to worry about enemies sending out annoying enemy reinforcements if they somehow take an unprotected base camp, or utilizing an ally unique potential or orders for interesting maneuvers, and etc. There are lots of options for interesting strategies from the vast amounts of diverse classes, weaponry, knowing the terrain, etc. That it makes Valkyria Chronicles 3, while a bit daunting at times, a lot of fun to strategize around with. Now the biggest con to the combat system is probably the level design, which, like Valkyria Chronicles 2, isn't all that strong. Now the level design isn't horrible, but they do reuse a lot of the maps, with some of the maps being reused from Valkyria Chronicles 2, which overall does put a damper on the combat. And another con that people can get out of this is that why Valkyria Chronicles 3 does make some balance changes to make things interesting, it's still overall the same combat system as 2. Another negative point I want to talk about is probably Fencers. Fencers were probably one of the best classes in Valkyria Chronicles 2. Not so much in 3. They got nerfed hard in this game, to the point where it's not even really viable to use them. They got nerfed that badly. Their offensive capabilities are on point as usual, but they can't survive long enough to get close to the enemies, unlike in 2. Yeah, the Fencers are basically a useless class in this game, which is unfortunate since I really did like using Fencers in the second game. And now we get to the leveling system in Valkyria Chronicles 3. Like in previous Valkyria Chronicles games, you'll be able to use the experience points and money you get from battle to strengthen your characters, with you being able to use your experience points to strengthen the stats of your troops and learn new orders, or use the money to buy stronger equipment to better arm your units, as well as buying new weapon types that will unlock the branch classes, such as buying the fencing sword will unlock fencers, or buying the sniper rifle will unlock the sniper class. How you upgrade your class is thankfully different from Valkyria Chronicles 2 credit system, where it's now based on how many times you use that unit. Every unit also have the ability to change to any class in the game, compared to Valkyria Chronicles 2 where only a Vaughn could, but each character still have a preference of what class they would benefit from in terms of their stats. And then there is the change in how potentials are learned. Potentials are learned when you upgrade your base class to a higher class, with there being 2 class potentials you can learn when you go from the base class to a veteran and veteran to elite, with the master table allowing you a clear guideline of which potential you can unlock by leveling up which class, with there being very powerful potentials you can learn by leveling up certain classes as shown by the master table. Overall, the leveling system is pretty well done in Valkyria Chronicles 3. You get a good feeling of progression as you get stronger, using the experience points to increase your stats, as well as learning orders, and getting better equipment, and unlocking classes via those equipment. The customization is also very varied, with there being a variety of weapons you can equip to your class that will change how they function, as well as the varied potentials you can learn by leveling up multiple classes that can really differentiate each character when trying to match class potentials to the unique personal potentials. The character building is very well done in Valkyria Chronicles 3, albeit the system does put more emphasis on certain characters compared to Valkyria Chronicles 1, where you can use any characters if you wish, but the benefit is that there is a lot more varied customization that people can tinker with throughout the game. Most notably endgame, that Valkyria Chronicles 3 can have a lot of staying power in terms of its customization. Overall, Valkyria Chronicles 3 in a lot of ways can be seen as a retrend of Valkyria Chronicles 2, with the game still sharing the same graphical and combat engine of Valkyria Chronicles 2, without there being much significant changes to the engine. With the changes that is there, with Valkyria Chronicles 3 more darker and somber story, its interesting and varied characters, how it presents the story, and overall gameplay balance changes does make it a much more engaging, intense, and more memorable experience than Valkyria Chronicles 2. Playing through this game, this is perhaps my favorite PSP game, with the quality of the game being really up there with Valkyria Chronicles, with the only shortcomings is probably the PSP limitations that the developer had to work around with. But perhaps the biggest tragedy looking at this game is that it never got a localization, which is a real shame since it's a really good game, and I do recommend people to try it out.